The United States had been facing a difficult decision on how to end the war with Japan. While traditional military tactics, such as the relentless bombing campaigns and island-hopping strategies, had already inflicted immense damage on Japan, they had not brought about the unconditional surrender that the Allies were demanding. The Japanese military leadership remained unwilling to accept defeat, believing that their ability to continue fighting was still intact. For the Allies, the use of the atomic bomb was seen as a means to compel Japan's surrender, without the need for an invasion of the Japanese home islands, which could have resulted in devastating casualties on both sides. The bombings were viewed as a way to break Japan's will to fight and avoid the horrific loss of life that would have been associated with a protracted ground invasion. At the time, American military planners believed that the Japanese would not surrender unless they were confronted with an overwhelming, shock-inducing weapon. The bomb was meant to achieve that shock, to force Japan's leadership to face the reality of their imminent destruction. And in this sense, the atomic bomb served as a tool of war to alter the tactical balance in a way that no other weapon could. President Harry S. Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb was a momentous one, shaped by both military necessity and the evolving global context. The decision was made in the context of a brutal, all-consuming war. By the summer of 1945, Truman was already under immense pressure to bring the war to an end as quickly as possible. The United States had already suffered tens of thousands of casualties in the Pacific, and the possibility of an invasion of Japan was increasingly seen as a disaster in the making. Truman, who had assumed the presidency after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, was confronted with an unprecedented moral and strategic dilemma. Though he had been briefed on the destructive power of the bomb, he could not have known the full impact of its use. His advisors, including military leaders and scientists, argued that using the bomb would save lives by bringing the war to a rapid close, even if it meant unleashing unimaginable destruction on civilian populations. The Japanese leadership, on the other hand, remained convinced that they could fight on. Emperor Hirohito, the figurehead of Japan's imperial system, had yet to make a decisive move toward peace. Despite evidence of Japan's weakening position, many within the military government, particularly the hardline faction, refused to accept unconditional surrender. Truman's decision, therefore, was one of both military pragmatism and an effort to force Japan's leaders to face the inevitable. By 1945, Japan was a shadow of its former self. The once powerful empire was crumbling under the weight of the Allied blockade, bombings, and relentless fighting on multiple fronts. Yet, despite their dire situation, Japan's military leadership remained fiercely committed to continuing the war. The belief that they could somehow secure a negotiated peace, especially with Soviet intervention or through maintaining their imperial status, remained a cornerstone of their strategy. In the final months of the war, Japan had even begun preparations for a full-scale defense of the home islands, which included plans for mass conscription of civilians into the fight. The military leadership was willing to sacrifice not only soldiers but also civilians in the defense of the country. This no-surrender mentality led them to miscalculate the threat posed by the atomic bomb. The Japanese leaders believed they could withstand more bombings even as their cities lay in ruins. The atomic bomb, however, shattered their assumptions. It was a weapon that could not be easily countered or ignored. After Hiroshima, Japan's leaders were forced to confront the reality that they no longer held the power to resist. The use of atomic weapons against Japan raised profound ethical questions that continue to haunt history. Was it justifiable to drop a bomb capable of eradicating entire cities, knowing that it would result in the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians? The question of morality in warfare had reached a new threshold, one that blurred the lines between military necessity and humanitarian devastation. On one hand, the bombings were seen as a necessary evil to bring a swift end to a war that had already cost millions of lives. The American government argued that it was a means to prevent an even greater loss of life, especially in a potential invasion of Japan. On the other hand, many historians, political figures, and even those involved in the Manhattan Project, such as Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, later expressed deep regret over the bomb's use. They saw it as an act of unprecedented destruction that violated the very principles of human dignity and respect for life. In the aftermath, Japan's civilians who had been caught in the devastation often found themselves grappling with the ethical implications as well. Many wondered if their government's refusal to surrender had condemned them to such horrors. The question of whether the atomic bombings were justified continues to divide opinions to this day. August 6, 1945, dawned with little indication of the calamity that would soon unfold. Hiroshima, a city of over 300,000 people, was a significant military hub, with industrial centers and troop concentrations, though it had not been heavily bombed like Tokyo or Osaka. In the early morning hours, a B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, flew over the city. The bomb Little Boy carried in the belly of the aircraft was about to be dropped from a height of 31,000 feet, the culmination of years of research, secrecy, and political decision-making. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released. The world changed. The explosion released the energy equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT, creating a shockwave that flattened the city in an instant. A bright flash, brighter than the sun, illuminated the entire city. The heat from the explosion reached 7,000 degrees, sufficient to instantly ignite fires across the city. As buildings collapsed and the earth trembled, Hiroshima was reduced to rubble. The immediate human toll was staggering. It's estimated that 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed instantly. Many more would die later from the effects of radiation, burns, and injuries. The city's infrastructure, its homes, schools, hospitals, everything was obliterated. In the aftermath, survivors stumbled through the smoldering ruins, many unable to comprehend the extent of the destruction, their minds in a state of shock, unable to fathom that their world had been torn apart by a single weapon. For the first time in history, humanity had witnessed a bomb that could entirely erase life in such a terrifyingly efficient manner. Hiroshima was not simply a military target, it was a demonstration of unimaginable power. The atomic bomb's purpose was not only to destroy, but also to send a clear message. The war could end on terms dictated by the United States, without the need for a costly invasion. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the United States dropped the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, on the port city of Nagasaki. The target was not as clearly defined as Hiroshima. Nagasaki was a significant industrial center, but the geography of the city, with its steep hills and narrow valleys, lessened the bomb's immediate effectiveness. Still, the impact was catastrophic. The bomb exploded with an equivalent force of 21,000 tons of TNT, creating an enormous fireball and spreading destruction across the city. Approximately 40,000 people were killed instantly, with tens of thousands more succumbing to the effects of burns and radiation in the days and weeks following. The people of Nagasaki were left stunned, unsure of what to make of the attack that seemed so surreal, yet utterly real. By the time Nagasaki had been hit, Japan's leadership had already begun to recognize the futility of continuing the war. Emperor Hirohito, who had remained largely a figurehead in military decisions, was now seriously considering the implications of the atomic bombings. Japan's military high command, despite its entrenched ideology, found it increasingly difficult to justify further resistance. The leadership faced an excruciating choice: surrender or face the destruction of their nation. At this point, Japan had experienced the horrifying power of nuclear warfare. The bombing shattered any remaining illusions about the strength of the Japanese military, and the possibility of continuing the fight was no longer tenable. As the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki made clear, Japan could not continue the war in the face of such devastating new technology. These bombings, though aimed at hastening the war's end, marked a decisive turning point not only for Japan but for humanity as a whole. The atomic bomb had now been used in actual combat, and there was no turning back. Its devastating effects would echo in the global psyche for decades to come. August 6, 1945. The sky above Hiroshima was a clear, oppressive blue, the heat of summer suffocating. The city, alive with the hum of daily life, had no inkling of the devastation that was about to unfold. In the early hours of the morning, as children began to trickle into their schools and the first workers filled the streets, a plane far above them began its final descent. The Enola Gay, a B-29 superfortress, carried a single payload, a bomb that could reshape the course of history. The world was about to witness a force of destruction unlike anything before it. With a flash that would sear the skies, the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, exploded above the city. A blinding light, hotter than the sun, engulfed the ground below. In an instant, thousands of lives were obliterated, and in the moments that followed, a stunned silence took hold, a silence marked by disbelief, fear, and the dawning realization that a new era of warfare had begun. The year was 1945. After almost 6 years of brutal warfare, the end of World War II seemed within grasp for the Allied forces. The Axis powers, once formidable, were crumbling. Germany had already surrendered in May, but the Pacific theater was far from over. The Japanese Empire, deeply entrenched on its home islands, had refused to surrender, despite mounting losses and the crippling Allied blockade. The Pacific War was a stalemate of attrition, a war that had already cost millions of lives. For the Allies, particularly the United States, the conflict had reached a critical juncture. The Japanese military had fought relentlessly, showing little regard for their own citizens' lives or the destruction left in their wake. Japan's leaders, under Emperor Hirohito and a rigid military hierarchy, remained steadfast in their resolve. They were determined to continue the war no matter the cost. But in the United States, the specter of an invasion of Japan's home islands was looming. The military planners in Washington, D.C. estimated that such an invasion could result in an unimaginable number of casualties, perhaps over 1 million Americans alone. The Battle of Okinawa in the spring of 1945 had demonstrated Japan's willingness to defend its homeland to the last man, with fierce kamikaze attacks and suicidal resistance from both soldiers and civilians. American casualties were mounting as the cost of a conventional invasion grew ever clearer. In this atmosphere of urgency, the Manhattan Project, an ambitious top-secret effort to develop a new weapon, had reached its final stage. By July 1945, scientists working in the deserts of New Mexico had successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb. The world's most powerful and terrifying weapon had been born, offering the United States an unprecedented advantage. Japan, however, remained defiant. Even after the devastating firebombing raids of Tokyo and other cities, the Japanese government refused to surrender. They continued to believe in their ability to resist, hoping that the Soviet Union might intervene, or that they could negotiate a peace favorable to their survival. They had not yet grasped the full magnitude of the threat they were facing. But on August 6, 1945, everything changed. The United States' decision to drop the atomic bomb was not made lightly. After years of intense research and testing, the bomb had proven to be more than just a theoretical concept. It was a terrifying reality. President Harry S. Truman, having assumed office in the wake of Franklin D. Roosevelt's death, was now faced with a decision that would shape the future of warfare. He and his advisors had several options for ending the war with Japan. But the growing fear of massive American casualties in an invasion of Japan, combined with the desire to bring the war to a swift conclusion, pushed the United States toward a decision that would forever change the landscape of global conflict. In the lead-up to the bombing, Japan's situation was dire, though not immediately apparent to its leadership. The Japanese military was shattered and its resources depleted. The Allied naval blockade had crippled Japan's ability to import oil, fuel, and other essential supplies. The Japanese economy was in tatters, and food shortages had become widespread. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, Japan's leadership remained locked in a mindset of stubborn resistance, unwilling to accept the reality of their defeat. At the same time, the Soviet Union, which had remained neutral in the Pacific conflict, had begun to shift its stance. Stalin had pledged to enter the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. With the war in Europe concluded, the Soviet Union prepared to invade Japanese-held Manchuria. This was a significant threat to Japan, but it came too late. The Japanese had already made their stand, and their internal resistance to peace talks remained rigid. The United States, having carefully weighed its options, turned to the atomic bomb as the ultimate leverage. On July 16, 1945, the first successful test of an atomic bomb took place at the Trinity test site in the New Mexico desert. The explosion created a blinding flash of light and a mushroom cloud that reached over 7 miles into the sky. The destructive power was unimaginable. Scientists involved in the project, including some of the greatest minds of the era like Robert Oppenheimer, were deeply aware of the potential consequences. Yet the urgency of ending the war quickly seemed to outweigh the moral and ethical questions surrounding the use of such a weapon. Japan, meanwhile, continued to hold out hope for a negotiated peace. Despite the devastation of the firebombing raids that had already razed much of Japan's cities, the government did not view the use of nuclear weapons as a real threat. They underestimated the power that was now at the disposal of their enemy. In a final, desperate effort to bring an end to the war without total surrender, Japan's leadership had considered a conditional peace offer, a peace that would have preserved the imperial system and potentially allowed Japan to avoid occupation. But the Allies, particularly the United States, rejected this offer, demanding unconditional surrender. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The scale of destruction that followed was unfathomable. The bomb obliterated much of the city, instantly killing tens of thousands of civilians. But for the Japanese leadership, the true impact of the weapon was not yet clear. They had not yet fully grasped the scale of this new force of war that was now at their doorstep. The lives of civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were forever altered on the morning of August 6th and 9th, 1945. In Hiroshima, as the sun rose, the city's streets were bustling with the daily rhythms of life. People went about their business unaware that a new kind of weapon had been unleashed against them. Little Boy, the atomic bomb, detonated 900 feet above the city center, releasing a wave of destruction that instantly wiped out everything in its radius. Buildings were leveled, fires raged, and the sky turned to a hellish orange. Those who were not killed by the explosion itself succumbed to the intense heat, the shock wave, or later, from radiation sickness. In Nagasaki, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, followed 3 days later, bringing the same horrors. The initial blast, though slightly less powerful due to the terrain of the city, was still catastrophic. Civilians were trapped under rubble, burned beyond recognition, or left to die slowly from radiation. In both cities, survivors were left in a state of shock, unable to comprehend the full scale of the devastation they had just witnessed. For them, the bomb represented the most extreme form of human suffering, the loss of life, the destruction of homes, and the unraveling of normalcy. In the face of unimaginable pain and loss, many survivors, known as hibakusha, would go on to live with the scars of that day for the rest of their lives, haunted by memories of the bomb's immediate devastation, as well as the long-term effects of radiation exposure. The atomic bomb was a technological marvel and a horrifying testament to the power of science and engineering. It was the product of the Manhattan Project, an intense, secretive effort that involved the brightest minds of the time, including physicists like J. Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi. The bomb itself was composed of uranium-235, a highly unstable isotope, and was designed to release an overwhelming amount of energy when it underwent a fission chain reaction. When Little Boy was dropped over Hiroshima, it unleashed an energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT, vaporizing buildings and people instantly. The blast created winds that reached over 1,000 miles per hour, knocking down structures miles away. The shockwave created a massive firestorm that consumed much of the city. Similarly, Fat Man, which used plutonium-239, was even more powerful. Its explosion caused a 1,000-foot-high mushroom cloud to rise above Nagasaki, while radiation poisoned the survivors, leaving them to suffer a slow and agonizing death. What made these bombs so devastating was their ability to cause near-instantaneous destruction on a scale never before seen in warfare. The use of atomic energy, harnessed to create weapons of mass destruction, marked a new era in military technology, one where the capacity for devastation could now surpass the limits of the human imagination. After the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's leadership was thrown into disarray. While the immediate toll of the atomic bombings was undeniable, the internal resistance within the Japanese military government was still formidable. However, with the second bomb dropped on Nagasaki, the reality became undeniable. Japan's continued survival in the war was no longer possible. The immense shock and suffering caused by the atomic bombings had left the country reeling, but it was not until the Soviet Union's entry into the war that the Japanese government realized their position was untenable. August 8, 1945, 2 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, and 1 Day before the bombing of Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Soviet forces quickly invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria, opening a second front that Japan could not resist. This unexpected development was the final blow to the Japanese hopes of a negotiated peace. The combination of the atomic bombings and the Soviet invasion left Japan with no realistic way to continue fighting. Even though Japan's leaders were now facing the unthinkable, the decision to surrender was not immediately forthcoming. There were still factions within the government that sought to negotiate a peace settlement, clinging to the belief that Japan could retain some measure of sovereignty through a diplomatic solution. But Emperor Hirohito, who had remained a symbol of resistance to the enemy, now saw that his nation's survival required a complete and unconditional surrender. On August 15, 1945, in a radio broadcast that would become one of the most pivotal moments in history, Hirohito announced Japan's surrender to his people. The decision was made not only in response to the sheer devastation of the atomic bombs, but also to prevent further destruction and preserve the imperial system. For the first time, the emperor explicitly acknowledged Japan's defeat, signaling the end of the Pacific War. Japan's surrender was officially signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, formally ending World War II. The atomic bombings, despite their unprecedented horror, had brought about the end of the war in the Pacific, albeit at a tremendous human cost. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just the end of World War II, they marked the dawn of a new, frightening era in global politics. The United States, having ushered in the atomic age, now stood alone with the power of nuclear weapons. The global balance of power had shifted irreversibly, and the future of warfare was forever changed. In the years following the end of World War II, the use of atomic bombs on Japan became the subject of intense debate and reflection. While many at the time saw the bombings as a necessary evil to end the war swiftly, others began to question the morality of using such a devastating weapon on civilian populations. The human suffering caused by the bombs, as well as the long-term effects of radiation, would leave scars on the Japanese population for generations. For the United States, the atomic bombings also signaled the beginning of a new phase in international relations. As the Cold War with the Soviet Union began to unfold, nuclear weapons became the central focus of military strategy and global diplomacy. The bombs that had ended one war also ensured that future conflicts would be fought in the shadow of atomic destruction. The aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the beginning of a world forever altered by the destructive potential of nuclear technology. But in Japan, the suffering and emotional toll on its people would remain a heavy burden long after the war had ended. The hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombings, would carry the painful memories of those days for the rest of their lives, while the rest of the world struggled to comprehend the implications of a weapon capable of ending life on such a massive scale. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki left Japan shattered, both physically and psychologically. The scale of the destruction was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Hiroshima, once a thriving industrial city, was reduced to ashes in an instant. The city's population, estimated at over 300,000, was decimated. Approximately 70,000 people were killed instantly, with the final death toll reaching as high as 140,000 due to radiation exposure, injuries, and the subsequent fires. In Nagasaki, the damage was equally catastrophic, though the city's mountainous terrain somewhat limited the extent of the devastation. Still, an estimated 40,000 to 75,000 people died in the initial explosion, with many more dying from radiation sickness and burns in the days and weeks that followed. In both cities, the survivors, those who had not been killed or severely injured, were left to cope with the unimaginable destruction of their homes and communities. Families were torn apart. Entire neighborhoods were gone. For those who lived through the bombings, the immediate aftermath was one of confusion, horror, and grief. Many survivors wandered the ruins in a daze, uncertain where to turn or what to do. The hospitals, too, were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses, themselves often victims of radiation exposure, worked tirelessly but helplessly, unable to treat the vast number of victims. The Japanese government, reeling from the loss of these two major cities, was now faced with an impossible decision. Emperor Hirohito, in consultation with his military and civilian leaders, had already started to consider the possibility of surrender, but the bombings and the Soviet Union's declaration of war hastened the process. In his historic radio address on August 15, 1945, Hirohito conveyed to the Japanese people that the war was over. It was the first time in Japan's history that the emperor had spoken directly to his citizens. Japan's formal surrender on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, marked the official end of World War II. The bombs had succeeded in doing what no conventional military strategy had been able to accomplish. They forced Japan's surrender, without a costly invasion of the home islands. While the immediate relief of ending the war was felt across the world, the human cost was staggering. In Japan, the consequences of the bombings would be felt for decades. Survivors, known as hibakusha, suffered not only the trauma of witnessing and surviving the bombings, but also the lasting physical effects of radiation exposure. Many lived with debilitating illnesses such as leukemia and cancer, which were linked to the bomb's radiation. The emotional scars were just as severe, as the survivors struggled to cope with the guilt of having lived through the horror, while so many others perished. For years, hibakusha faced discrimination, as their illnesses were misunderstood or stigmatized by society. Their stories became a poignant reminder of the human cost of nuclear war. As Japan began its post-war reconstruction, the country was devastated. The bombings had obliterated the urban centers of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and much of Japan's infrastructure had been destroyed by relentless Allied bombing campaigns. With much of its economy in ruins and its population facing the challenges of rebuilding from the ground up, Japan turned to the United States for assistance. The United States occupied Japan under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, initiating a period of profound transformation. The Japanese economy would eventually recover, and the country would undergo major political reforms, including the establishment of a new constitution that renounced war as a means of settling international disputes. But the psychological toll of the atomic bombings on the Japanese population would remain for years. The hibakusha, who survived the bombs, became both symbols of resilience and tragic reminders of the immense cost of the war. They would go on to become vocal advocates for nuclear disarmament, helping to ensure that the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not forgotten in the years that followed. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki also set the stage for a new era of global politics. The United States, having demonstrated its overwhelming nuclear capabilities, found itself in a new and unprecedented position of power. While the end of World War II brought relief to many nations, the advent of nuclear weapons also ushered in a new kind of global tension, the Cold War. The United States' monopoly on atomic weapons was short-lived. By 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own nuclear bomb, creating a new and terrifying balance of power. The Cold War, marked by ideological and political rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, was in many ways a war of nerves, one in which the threat of nuclear annihilation loomed over every conflict. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated the destructive potential of nuclear weapons, and the subsequent arms race between the US and the Soviet Union led to the stockpiling of even more powerful nuclear arsenals. The legacy of the atomic bombings would shape military strategy and international diplomacy for generations. Nuclear deterrence, the idea that the threat of mutual annihilation would prevent large-scale conflict between nuclear powers, became the cornerstone of global security policy during the Cold War. But this policy also came with its own set of risks, as the possibility of accidental or intentional nuclear war remained ever present. In Japan, the bombings became a catalyst for the global movement for nuclear disarmament. The devastation caused by Little Boy and Fat Man left a lasting scar on the collective consciousness of humanity. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of the horror of nuclear weapons and the need to prevent their use in future conflicts. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki not only brought an end to World War II, but also opened a new, terrifying chapter in human history. The profound devastation that these bombs caused, both in the immediate aftermath and in the generations that followed, highlighted a tragic paradox. Humanity's ability to create technological marvels was now matched by its capacity for unimaginable destruction. For Japan, the bombings were a collective trauma, a national reckoning with both the cruelty of war and the futility of resistance. The survivors, the hibakusha, embodied the bitter legacy of nuclear warfare. They carried the physical and psychological scars of a weapon that altered the very fabric of their society. Yet in their resilience, they became advocates for peace and disarmament, urging the world to remember the horror they endured so that it might never be repeated. Their voices, though born from the pain of survival, carried a powerful message of hope, a hope that humanity could learn from the past and prevent the unchecked spread of nuclear weapons. On a global scale, the bombings also marked the dawn of the nuclear age, a time when the very existence of humanity seemed to hang in the balance. The Cold War, with its ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation, shaped international relations for decades. The balance of power between nuclear nations became defined by the doctrine of deterrence, the idea that no side would dare launch a nuclear attack, knowing that such an action would lead to mutual destruction. While this strategy of mutually assured destruction kept the peace between the superpowers, it also meant living in the shadow of a weapon capable of ending civilization as we know it. The atomic bombings, in their horror, forced the world to confront the ethical and moral dimensions of warfare in a way never before imagined. The question of whether such a weapon should ever be used again remains a haunting debate. Should the use of the bomb on Japan be seen as a necessary evil, a means to end a brutal war, or was it a crime against humanity, an irreversible act that caused suffering far beyond what could be justified? In the end, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is one that calls upon us to reflect on the cost of war, the price of technological advancement, and the moral responsibility of wielding such power. The shadow of those bombings looms large over the 20th century and beyond, reminding us of the devastating potential of nuclear weapons and the necessity of striving for a future free of their threat. May the world never forget the lessons learned from the atomic bombings, not as a means to justify destruction, but as a call to safeguard humanity from the darkness that nuclear weapons represent.